Well, I love finding sheds, and we're very fortunate, Dylan, even Joe, Kevin, Wes, when we're out on client properties, we get to find sheds and find antlers in lots of different states. So kind of a luxury, because around here we're looking at our own property, whether it's Wisconsin or Minnesota, and we're finding sheds. But when you get to look at 7 or 8 properties in around a week in different states, it's really cool to be able to find them. And I don't know, there's just always something about finding them. And really in the end, does it really mean anything? Where deer are staying right now in the winter, does it really reflect where they're at in the fall? To me, shed hunting, I love finding them. We have piles around here, pile right back here. I love just finding them. Tells you that buck is alive. That's probably what it means to me the most, that he's still out there, he's still around, he's probably going to be there during the season. But even then, we found shed antlers before and then not found or ever seen that buck again. And I can think of Lucky. He was either a 5 or 6 year old buck. We watched him for several years, and then all of a sudden we watched him, pass him up during hunting season, thought, well, maybe we'll shoot him the next year, find his antlers in March sometime, and then never see him again. So you just don't know what happens to some of these bucks. But regardless, so I wanted to talk about how to shed hunt, find antlers really quick. And I think you can spend a lot of time, kind of the old 80-20 rule, where you can accomplish 80% of a task by completing 20% of the work. It gets you 80% of the way there. And I think shed hunting applies to that too, where you're really looking at a smaller portion of the habitat, but that gives you huge results when it comes to finding where those antlers are. So let's just look at, you're going out to a new area, and we'll talk about when and where, that kind of thing, but that's completely another video. The shed timing is really difficult. I can say real quick, we'll just skip down to when to go. If it's public land, I'd hit it early and often. Those deer get pushed around anyways. Other people are shed hunting. You never know where they're going to drop. So it's not like a private land parcel where there's no other pressure and these antlers could drop at any time, but you're almost trying on private land, look at it, the timing of when the squirrels are going to eat them. So otherwise you just wait till the end of March and look before leaf out. You just look at that time every year. We want to find them before the squirrels do, but at the same time we don't want to spook them off that little private parcel that we're hunting. So the timing is a lot different there. We're watching right now, since we're talking about timing, we watch antlers fall. We're watching bucks without one side or without both sides, and we've really seen, it's February 10th right now, can honestly say in the last 10 days, we've really seen an exponential amount of antlers dropping. Where if we went back 2 weeks ago, it was basically 1 2-year-old 8-point that had dropped a half, and then both, and then 2 wounded bucks that we knew about. And other than that, it was just those 3. And then now, Junior, a lot of our named bucks, Junior, he had half rack, and then I think no rack now. We had Pokey. Pokey had full and then half, and now we see big bucks without them. You really don't know. And then we were wondering about Righty, and we just saw Righty yesterday with both of his. So it's funny how you look at some of these, the bucks. Trouble we saw a little bit ago, he had both sides just within the last 3 days. We see a lot of these. We have another buck we call North. He had both of them this morning. We got a video of them. I would say right now we're at that 30%, 25% mark, somewhere around there. And I don't like going shed hunting until we're 60, 70, 80% of those antlers drop, because we're just going to push bucks around and they're going to go on someone else's property and lose them there. And it's not that big of a deal. We're not going to put off doing work that we want to accomplish out on the property. We're just mindful of that, where certain bucks live in certain areas of the property that we don't go into and potentially spook if we can avoid it. So your timing might be different in your area. It's February 10th now. I would say by the end of February, we're usually at that 70, 80% mark. So that means early March, we'll be hitting hard. UP of Michigan, where I used to live, half the bucks were shed either half or both by New Year's. That was different. That was big wilderness area, not a lot of food, a lot of winter stress, a lot of weather stress, and a lot of habitat stress. So completely different environment where they're not stressed out. They're going to typically hold longer. And it was interesting, in that same area in penned deer in the Cousineau Research Facility in Shingleton that they ran for almost 30 years for deer research, when they were supplementally fed, the deer, they were not genetically manipulated deer. They weren't brought in from other areas. They were just deer that were fenced in from that area, that locale. The outside of the fence are dropping almost completely by January 15th, and on the inside of the fence are dropping closer to March, because they were supplementally fed. So same habitat, they just had a lot more food. Same weather, just a lot more food. So that food plays a big difference. And that kind of leads me to my first point of where to find these antlers right here. Food. Food is a big area. And I had someone say, well, we never find antlers in our food plots. That's because they're not eating them at that time of year. So if you don't have food that's providing actual browse and sustenance right now, then if your food plots are bare, then why would you find antlers around those locations? Deer are dropping their antlers where they spend the most time. So right now, let's break that down even further. Grain. When it's super cold, super snowy, they're going to hit corn and beans a lot harder. But it has to be standing still. That's a good example because we have a neighbor here that plants really grain heavy. We're green heavy. We're a little bit more balanced. Instead of 15 acres of beans and corn and 3 or 4 acres of green, so 75%, let's say, of grain, we're more at 1/3 grain, where you have more like 13 acres compared to 6 acres or 7 acres. 7 acres of corn versus 13 acres of green. So what happens in a winter like last year, was a warm winter, we didn't have much snow, we found a lot more antlers because they're heavily and happily hitting green during the winter time. It provides them more nutrition, energy. They can get to it because there's no snow. It's warm, it's soft. They're not having to chisel down to it through a bunch of layers of ice. It's easy. They don't really have to leave their fall ranges. However, on a winter where you get deep snows and a lot of cold, they're going to hit that grain very heavy. And so our neighbor will find as many antlers as we do on those years, where we'll find a disproportionate amount on those light years. This is another light year. We have a lot of bucks hanging around right now. So I expect us to find a lot of antlers this year when we go to look towards the end of this month, early March. It's because we have that more of a balance. They're hitting some of our corn right now really hard. It's not going to last too much longer. But with this more mild winter, we're doing pretty well for holding a lot of deer. So that green works really well, grain depending on the year, and then growth. What I'm referring to on that is regeneration. So you're out on public land and you have big clear cut edges next to swamps, diversity of habitat, all awesome areas to find antlers. And what's cool on public land with something like that is a lot of acres on public land are going to be wide open. And I'm not saying you're not going to find an antler in those wide open areas, but those are that 80% of the forest to provide 20% of the antlers. You're going to find the majority around those food sources and bedding areas. And when you're on public land, those diversity areas, regen areas are few and far between. And they're going to hold a disproportionate number or amount of shed antlers. So I'm looking, if it's a warm winter, then you might look at traditional fall bedding areas, maybe bench tops, ridge tops, point saddles, where you might find traditional bedding. South facing is nice because there's a lot more regen there, so it provides a lot more food in those locations. But if there's really strong south winds and it's a cold winter, you might actually find more antlers on the north side, even though it doesn't have that food and that browse, because they're going to spend, or an equal amount on the north side, because they need to get out of the wind during the winter time when it's really super cold. They can get frostbite ears pretty easily. So as the deer becomes older, they know where to bed to get out of that wind and to conserve energy. So you can't always say they're going to be on just the south side, because if they need to get out in the wind, those deer are going to be bedding on the north side, which is part of this equation. So bedding areas, obviously known bedding areas, and those bedding areas could vary greatly, just like food, depending on the winter. If it's a really harsh, snowy winter, they're going to favor more conifers, swamps, lowland, so they're out of that wind. But then if it's a warm winter with not a lot of snow, like the last two, and we've had some cold this year, it's colder than last year, but at the same time we have hardly any snow. And but you're going to find a lot of those deer bedding in those more thermal protected areas during harsh winters, and more traditional fall bedding areas during warm winters. They don't have to move. Deer don't want to move from their fall ranges into heavy wintering areas. And the UP of Michigan and northern upstate New York, northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, those are really good examples of that, where deer will traditionally migrate to deer yards. They don't want to migrate to deer yards. There's not a lot of food there. Predators seem to stock up in those areas. They're confined to small areas, big numbers of deer. They'd rather be in their fall areas. And we would see that because we'd get a snow in November, let's say a good 8-inch snow, you'd see deer start to use those migration trails. It'd melt, they come back. They even say the same doe family groups are bucks. Then you get a big snow, they'd go down, then it'd melt, they'd come back. Whereas if it just snowed and snowed and snowed, they'd be gone and they wouldn't come back for 4 months. So a big difference. So there was that seesaw effect when the weather's was more of a roller coaster of snow and cold and then back to warm again. They just don't want to leave their fall ranges. They prefer those areas. There's typically more browse, but at some point they have to leave. So those bedding areas could vary greatly depending on the winter. Then you get into the areas in between. Well, there could be a lot of areas in between food sources and bedding areas. They're going to spend their majority of the time in those food sources and bedding areas. But there's some great areas that knock off antlers in between. And I would say fence crossings, ditch crossings, really thick choke points and funnels that are between food and bedding. Those are going to grab a lot of those antlers. And think about the 80% rule. And what I mean by that is you're going to find 80% of your sheds in these bedding areas, food sources, thick fences, ditches, crossings. And again, going back to food, if you have food plots, we found years where we've had a lot of food or a lot of antlers around a particular food plot because that's where they're feeding all winter long. And then you could have other food plots or other locations where that food's down to the dirt. Well, you're not going to find a lot of antlers around there. So it tells you a lot about your food plot program too and how long it's lasting into the winter if you're finding antlers on food or not. The 80% of the rule, you're going to find 80% of your sheds in these areas. There's a lot of areas in between. There's a lot of open timber in between, a lot of big fields in between. There's a lot of areas that aren't going to hold a very high percentage of the antlers, but they're always going to hold some antlers. So 20% of the antlers, 25, 30, whatever that number is. But if you're speed shed hunting, hit these 3 areas hard. Just look at these thick choke points, ditches, fences, crossings. Look at the bedding areas, food sources, look at those fast. And even on public land, really look around some of those clear-cut edges, diversity edges for a disproportionate number of sheds. And then we already talked about when to go. Public land, hit it hard and often. Private, really monitor and make sure you're looking for that 60, 70, 80% shed drop timing, which is not right now for us right here or over in Wisconsin. And you see that regionally, like people say, oh, they're dropping early. And I'm like, we see the same thing every single year. If they're wounded, if they're stressed, they'll drop early, but that's the outlier. Look at that typical drop time for us is more mid to late February. Like I said, it's starting to exponentially change right now, but really keep that in mind when you're going shed hunting, getting out there, learn how to speed shed hunt, cover a lot of ground quickly, look for these favorable locations, and you'll be on those antlers consistently each and every year. Everyone, thanks for watching to the end of the video. I really want you to check out whitetailhabitatsolutions.com, Pure Wildlife Blends. There's so much we have to offer you. If you never buy anything from us or hire us to come to your land, that's okay. We're still going to be putting out all this free content to try to help you out. I want to put a smile on your face and want you to have a great hunt. But from our food plot seed blends, to books, to web classes, to hiring us, we have lots of stuff to offer on whitetailhabitatsolutions.com and Pure Wildlife Blends. Make sure you check it out. The links are in the description.